For 10 years, the Greeks stood outside the walls of Troy. They had ships, soldiers, and some of the greatest warriors in mythology, but they still couldn't enter the city. Then, according to legend, they built a giant wooden horse, hid armed men inside it, and left it outside Troy's gates. The Trojans believed the war was finally over. They pulled the horse into their city, and before sunrise, Troy was burning. But that was only the beginning. One of the men supposedly hidden inside the horse was Odysseus, the clever king whose journey home became one of the most influential stories ever told. Over the next 10 years, he would encounter a one-eyed giant, a woman who transformed men into animals, creatures whose voices drove sailors to their deaths, and a whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire ship. He would lose every man who sailed with him. He would enter the world of the dead, and when he finally returned home, he would commit an act of revenge so violent that it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Was Odysseus actually a hero, or was he simply the last survivor of a brutal age? These are 8 of the darkest myths behind the Odyssey. 7 of them involve monsters. The last one doesn't need any. And some of them may have been inspired by things that were completely real. 1. The Trojan Horse. The most famous object in the Trojan War never actually appears in the Iliad. Homer's Iliad ends before Troy is destroyed. The wooden horse is briefly remembered in the Odyssey, while a more complete version familiar today was written centuries later in stories, such as Virgil's Aeneid. According to the legend, the war had lasted 10 years. The Greek armies had failed to break Troy's enormous defensive walls, so Odysseus proposed a different kind of weapon, not a stronger army, not a larger siege tower. A lie. The Greeks constructed an enormous wooden horse and concealed a group of warriors inside it. The remaining army burned its camp and sailed away, or at least appeared to. One Greek soldier, Sinon, remained behind. When the Trojans discovered him, he claimed that the horse was a sacred offering and that bringing inside Troy would protect the city. Not everyone believed him. The priest Laocoon warned the Trojans not to trust anything left behind by their enemies. Cassandra, cursed to predict the future without ever being believed, also understood that the horse would destroy them. But the warnings failed. The Trojans dragged the structure through their gates and celebrated the apparent end of the war. That night, while the city slept, the hidden soldiers climbed out. They opened the gates, signaled the returning Greek fleet, and allowed the army to enter. Troy was destroyed from within. Archaeologists have discovered that Troy was not merely an imaginary city. The site at Hazarlik in modern Turkey contains thousands of years of occupation, including heavily fortified Bronze Age settlements. But archaeology has never confirmed that a giant wooden horse was responsible for the city's destruction. Some researchers have suggested that the horse may have originally represented a siege machine, an earthquake, a ship, or simply a metaphor for deception. But none of those explanations has been proven. The archaeological city is real. The famous horse remains a legend, and perhaps that is why the story survived. It turns war into a warning. The most dangerous weapon is not always the one trying to break through your walls. Sometimes it's the one you willingly invite inside. 2. The Lotus Eaters. Not every danger in this story tries to kill you. This one is more dangerous, because it doesn't have to. After leaving Troy, Odysseus' men were driven off course by violent winds. Eventually, they reached a land inhabited by people known as the Lotus Eaters. They weren't soldiers. They didn't attack the visitors. They simply offered them something to eat. But the men who tasted the lotus immediately lost the desire to return home. They didn't forget their names. They didn't become unconscious. They simply stopped caring about everything they had once wanted. Their families, their journey, and the homeland they had fought to reach no longer mattered. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force and tie them beneath the rowing benches before ordering the fleet to leave. It's one of the shortest episodes in the Odyssey, but it may also be one of its most modern. The danger isn't pain. It's comfort. The lotus offers an existence without grief, responsibility, or longing. After years of violence, perhaps forgetting the journey home would have felt like mercy. Ancient and modern writers have proposed several real plants as a possible lotus, but there is no agreement about what Homer intended, and the plant's identity may not be the point. The Lotus Eaters represent a temptation that appears repeatedly throughout Odysseus' journey. What if returning home is too difficult? What if abandoning the struggle feels better? The men weren't imprisoned on the island. They wanted to stay, and that made the Lotus more dangerous than any monster. 3. The Cyclops. The next island appeared peaceful. There were sheep, goats, fertile land, and a cave filled with food. Odysseus' crew wanted to take what they could and leave. Odysseus refused. He wanted to meet the cave's owner. That decision would cost 6 men their lives. The owner was Polyphemus, a Cyclops described as an enormous one-eyed shepherd. When Polyphemus discovered the strangers inside his cave, Odysseus asked for hospitality. In the ancient Greek world, hospitality wasn't simply good manners. It was considered a sacred obligation protected by Zeus. But Polyphemus had no interest in sacred customs. He seized 2 men, killed them, and ate them. Then he blocked the cave entrance with a stone so heavy that Odysseus and the surviving men couldn't move it. Killing the Cyclops immediately would trap them inside. So Odysseus created a plan. He gave Polyphemus powerful wine and told him that his name was Nobody. When the Cyclops fell asleep, the men heated a sharpened wooden stake and drove it into his single eye. Polyphemus screamed for help. Other Cyclopes gathered outside and asked who was attacking him. His answer was exactly what Odysseus had planned. Nobody. Believing that no one was harming him, they left, but Polyphemus still guarded the cave entrance. So Odysseus tied his men beneath the Cyclops sheep. When the blinded giant touched the animals leaving the cave, he felt only their backs and failed to notice the men underneath. The escape succeeded. Then Odysseus made a disastrous mistake. Safely aboard his ship, he revealed his real name. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon, and once the sea god learned who had blinded his son, Odysseus' journey became a personal punishment. There's an intriguing theory about where the Cyclops myth may have originated. Mediterranean islands, such as Sicily, contain fossil remains of dwarf elephants. Their skulls have a large opening in the center, where the trunk was once connected. To someone who had never seen an elephant, that opening could resemble the eye socket of a giant one-eyed creature. The idea was proposed in the early 20th century, but it remains a hypothesis, not proof that fossils created the Cyclops legend. The real horror of the episode, however, is not the monster. Odysseus defeats Polyphemus through intelligence, but his pride prevents him from leaving quietly. He survives because he calls himself Nobody. Then he condemns himself by insisting that the world remember his name. For Circe and the men who became animals. After more disasters, Odysseus' surviving crew reached the island of Aea. A group of men discovered an isolated palace belonging to a mysterious woman named Circe. She welcomed them inside. She fed them. She gave them wine. Then she transformed them into pigs. Only one man escaped and returned to warn Odysseus. On his way to rescue the others, Odysseus met the god Hermes, who gave him a magical plant that would protect him from Circe's power. Circe attempted the same spell. It failed. Odysseus drew his sword, and Circe surrendered. She restored his men to human form. And then something strange happened. Odysseus and his crew stayed with her for an entire year. Circe begins the episode as a terrifying threat, but she later becomes an advisor. She explains how Odysseus can enter the world of the dead, and warns him about the dangers awaiting him at sea. That makes her more complicated than a simple villain. But the transformation of the men has inspired centuries of interpretation. Were they literally changed into animals? Or did Circe reveal something already inside them? In many stories, transformation is a punishment. Here, the men lose their human appearance after accepting food and pleasure, without questioning the person offering it. The pigs may symbolize appetite without reason. Human beings reduced to hunger, fear, and instinct. The episode also reflects ancient anxieties about foreigners, drugs, hospitality, and powerful women living outside male-controlled society. But Circe does not remain defeated. She negotiates with Odysseus. She helps him, and of all the creatures he encounters, she may understand his journey better than he does. For myths end, and a pattern has formed. Every threat so far, Odysseus has defeated with his mind. A trick, a name, a plan. That pattern is about to break. Starting now, cleverness stops being enough. 5. The Sirens. Today, Sirens are usually imagined as beautiful mermaids. That is not how early Greek artists portrayed them. Ancient sirens were often creatures with women's heads and the bodies, wings and claws of birds. Over centuries, artists gradually transformed them into the mermaid-like figures familiar today. Their weapon was not physical strength. It was knowledge. Circe warned Odysseus that the siren song drew sailors toward them. Once enchanted, the men would never return home. Bones and decaying bodies surrounded the creature's island. Odysseus wanted to hear the song, but he also wanted to survive. So he ordered his crew to soften wax and press it into their ears. Then he instructed them to tie him tightly to the ship's mast. No matter how much he begged, threatened, or demanded, they were not to release him. As the ship approached, the sirens began to sing. They didn't merely promise pleasure. They claimed to possess knowledge of Troy and everything that happened across the earth. Odysseus struggled against the ropes. He demanded to be freed. His crew couldn't hear him. They tightened the restraints and continued rowing until the voices disappeared. The sirens represent more than temptation. They represent the belief that knowledge belongs to the person willing to risk everything for it. Odysseus survives because he creates limits before he hears the song. He understands that the version of himself under its influence cannot be trusted. That is what makes the scene so psychologically powerful. He doesn't defeat temptation through willpower. He defeats it by making escape impossible. 6. Scylla and Charybdis. The next danger offered no clever solution. Odysseus had to guide his ship through a narrow passage. On one side lived Scylla, a creature with multiple long necks and 6 terrifying heads. On the other side was Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed the sea and later released again. Sailing too close to Charybdis could destroy the entire ship. Passing Scylla meant losing men. Circe advised Odysseus to choose Scylla. 6 lives were better than everyone. Odysseus did not tell his crew. Perhaps he believed they would panic. Perhaps he knew they would refuse. As they rowed through the passage, the men watched Charybdis and tried to avoid the whirlpool. That was when Scylla attacked. 6 heads descended. Each one seized a sailor. Odysseus later described watching the men reach toward him as they were carried away as one of the most painful sights of his journey. He survived because he knowingly sailed his men toward a monster. Scylla and Charybdis may preserve ancient memories of hazardous sailing routes, narrow channels, violent currents, hidden rocks, and unpredictable whirlpools. But there is no single confirmed real location. The myth eventually produced the expression between Scylla and Charybdis, trapped between 2 dangers with no safe choice. That is what makes this episode different from the Cyclops or the Sirens. There is no trick. There is no perfect escape. Only a decision about how many people must be sacrificed. 7. The world of the dead. One journey is darker than anything covered so far, and chronologically, it actually happened earlier, before the Sirens and before Scylla and Charybdis. He sailed beyond familiar world to consult the dead. At a remote shore, he dug a trench and performed a sacrifice. The spirits began to gather. But in Homer's Underworld, the dead were not powerful gods. They were shadows. They remembered life, but they could no longer fully participate in it. Odysseus allowed selected spirits to drink sacrificial blood, temporarily giving them the strength to communicate. He spoke with the prophet Tiresias, who warned him about the journey ahead. Then Odysseus saw his mother. She had been alive when he left for Troy. Now she was among the dead. Odysseus attempted to embrace her 3 times. Each time, his arms passed through her. He also encountered Agamemnon, murdered after returning home from Troy. And he spoke with Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek army. In life, Achilles had chosen a short existence filled with glory over a long, ordinary life. In death, that bargain looked very different. The Underworld chapter changes the entire story. Until this point, home is simply the destination Odysseus is trying to reach. But among the dead, he learns that returning home does not guarantee safety. Agamemnon returned and was murdered. Achilles gained eternal fame and regretted the price. His mother died while waiting. The Trojan War produced legendary heroes, but the Underworld reveals what their legends concealed. Almost everyone lost. 8. The massacre at Ithaca. 20 years after leaving, Odysseus finally reached Ithaca. No Cyclops, no Sirens, no six-headed monster guarding the shore. This time, the danger was entirely human, but he did not enter his palace as a king. Athena disguised him as an elderly beggar. During his absence, powerful men had occupied his home. They consumed his livestock, insulted his household, and pressured his wife, Penelope, to choose a new husband. Penelope delayed them through a famous trick. She promised to select a husband after completing a burial cloth for Odysseus' father. Every day, she worked on it. Every night, she secretly undid part of what she had woven. But eventually, the deception was discovered. Odysseus entered the palace and watched the suitors mistreat him because they believed he was powerless. He waited. Penelope then announced a contest. She would marry the man capable of stringing Odysseus' bow and firing an arrow through a line of axe heads. The suitors tried. None succeeded. The beggar asked for a turn. He lifted the bow, strung it effortlessly, and fired. Then Odysseus revealed who he was. With the help of his son Telemachus and a small group of loyal servants, he sealed the exits and killed the suitors. The revenge is often presented as the restoration of justice, but it is difficult to read the scene without noticing its brutality. Even servants accused of helping the suitors are executed. The palace becomes a battlefield, and the hero who has spent the entire story trying to return home brings the violence of Troy back with him. This is where modern audiences often misunderstand ancient heroes. A Greek hero was not necessarily a morally good person. A hero could be violent, proud, deceptive, and destructive. What made him heroic was his extraordinary ability to act, suffer, and leave a name that survived him. Odysseus is intelligent. He is resilient. He loves his homeland. But he is also responsible for terrible decisions. The epic does not ask us to admire everything he does. It asks us to witness what it costs him to survive. Conclusion: the world of the Odyssey is filled with impossible creatures. A one-eyed giant, a woman who transforms men into animals, bird-like monsters whose songs destroy sailors, a six-headed predator living beside a whirlpool. But the monsters are not the only reason the story survived for nearly 3,000 years. The journey is filled with dangers that remain familiar: addiction, pride, curiosity, grief, the temptation to abandon responsibility, the fear of returning home after becoming someone your family may no longer recognize. Even the Trojan Horse is not really a story about a wooden structure. It is a story about misplaced trust. The Cyclops is not only about a giant. It is about intelligence corrupted by ego. The Sirens are not only monsters. They are the voice that tells you one dangerous decision will finally reveal everything. And Odysseus is not simply a hero. He is a survivor trying to return to the person he was before the war, only to discover that person may no longer exist. That may be the darkest myth of all. Not that monsters once lived beyond the edge of the map, but that after surviving them, Odysseus carried part of their violence home with him. And perhaps that is why we are still telling his story. Because beneath the gods, giants, and impossible seas, the Odyssey was never only about finding the way home. It was about whether anyone can truly return unchanged.